sorry. Didn't know I was recording there. My bad. Sorry about that. Well, today, hello, welcome back to another psychology video. What we are going to talk about today is the process of hearing. So I suppose we can say, how am I able to hear through the speakers, my jam party in the USA? How is it able to travel through my ears and to my brain for me to then perceive the noises that I am hearing? How am I able to hear and dance along to Party in the USA? So that is what we are talking about today, the process of hearing. So let's go ahead and jump right into that. All right, so the very first thing that we have to talk about is the term audition. And in this case, audition is not talking about like when you audition for a play or something like that, but instead it is the sense or the act of hearing. So in the same way that we call vision the sense of seeing, audition is the sense of hearing. So make sure that you know that term. Next up, when we are trying to figure out how air pressure waves become sound, that is what we need to understand in terms of how things turn from a sensation in the environment around us and then are transferred into waves that go through our ears and eventually are processed then through our brain and perceived into specific noises. So for example here, if you play violin, if you are pulling the bow across the violin, it unleashes this energy of sound waves. So air molecules are all then bumping into one another, and that creates waves of compressed and expanded air, which is kind of like the ripples of a pond when you toss a stone and how it just kind of ripples like that. That's kind of the same thing that what's happening with our air molecules all bumping into one another to create these waves. So then your ears kind of detect these brief air pressure changes, and that is then transmitted eventually into the process of sound. So just like with vision, we have different wavelengths and amplitude of waves that then help us to determine specific features about that sound. So remember, for vision, if we are speaking about frequency, as these colors show you here, so frequency is how often is that wave happening. If it's a short wavelength, then that tells you it is things like your hue of like bluer colors and everything. If it was a longer wavelength, it's your more hues of red. So similarly here with hearing, the frequency is telling us that if we have shorter wavelengths, that is our higher pitched sounds. So if it's high frequency, it's happening more times in a row, then that leads to a higher pitched sound. If it is a longer wavelength here, that is a lower frequency, that is a lower pitched sound. So on the other hand, though, we know with vision that amplitude, the height of the wave, tells us how bright or how muted a tone is. So in hearing, the amplitude or height tells us if the height is very high, that is our louder sounds. If the height is very low, that is our softer sounds. So I kind of like to think about it for both vision and hearing. The way that it works is that the frequency corresponds to how exactly we perceive like the tone of whatever it is we're focusing on. So with vision, that means that is what is the color of it. With hearing, that is what is the sound of it. Is it high pitched? Is it low pitched? And then amplitude I think of as intensity. So in vision, that is how bright or how muted is this thing. And in terms of hearing, it's how loud or how soft is this thing. So do make sure you know the differences between frequencies and amplitude and what that tells you about exactly what a wave would mean. And so we just covered this, so you can take a look at that again. So as I noted here, just keep in mind that both light and sound travel in waves. So the main focus we have for this portion here about hearing is the structures of the ear and what exactly that looks like, just how we went through the different parts in the anatomy of the eye and their functions. We're going to do the same here with the ear. So to start us off, there are three main divisions of the ear that you need to know. There is the outer ear here, which is pretty much just your ear on the outside and that kind of tunnel inside. Then we have the middle ear, which are these three little tiny bones here. And then the inner ear, which is this very inside part here, which kind of looks like a snail almost. And then that eventually travels to your brain. So let's talk through that whole process here. Starting first with how your ear is going to transform sound into neural messages, we have that passing through accessory structures to sense receptors, vibrating air triggers. Vibrating air triggers nerve impulses that the brain decodes as sounds. So, yet again, it's just kind of these waves being vibrations that then get processed through the ear. All right, so starting with the outer ear here, this very outer portion, we have our auditory canal first. And the auditory canal is this kind of little tunnel part here. So it's like in your ear, it's kind of, you're not really supposed to use Q-tips because that can damage your ear. But say you were to stick a Q-tip in your ear, the part that the Q-tip can go in, that is the auditory canal there. And so that is the very outer part of the ear. The ear itself, the part you see, that part is called the pinna. So that's part of the outer ear as well. Then the sound will go through your auditory canal until it hits this thing called your eardrum. So with each of these parts of the ear we're going to be talking about, there is kind of two different names for all of these things. There's the more common name, and then there's kind of the Latin name of things. So you should be familiar with both because you might only see one or the other on an exam. So you want to make sure you know what each of those are. So for the eardrum, this is also known as the tympanic membrane. So whenever you see the word tympanic membrane, you should think eardrum. And eardrum is this little part right here that you can see. It almost just looks like this like flap almost that is where your sound is coming from the outer ear, and it hits that part. And right after it hits the eardrum is when it then transitions into the middle ear. So in the middle ear, we have this thing that is this grouping of things that's called ossicles. And ossicles are made up of three tiny little bones. And fun fact, these are the three smallest bones that you have in your entire body. They're located in your ear. So we have the malleus, that's kind of the Latin name. We commonly call it the hammer. The incus, Latin name, common name is anvil. And the Latin name for the last one is the stapes, commonly known as the stirrup. So first things happen in the eardrum, which then get transferred into the hammer, anvil, and stirrup, which then it ends up traveling on to our next portion, which is going to be our oval window. So if you look at this picture here, it's really hard to see right now, but these three tiny little bones here, those are our malleus, incus, and stapes that we are focusing on. And I'm going to have closer up images of each of these for you in a moment. But our next part from there, we just went through our stirrup was our last one. So it connects then to this thing that is called an oval window. So the oval window is where the stirrup attaches then to our snail-like figure called the cochlea. So when that pressure from our hammer, anvil, and stirrup then hit the oval window, it travels to the cochlea, and that is what's then going to create this movement through fluid for our sound. So then this next part I want to tell you about is the cochlea, which is a really, really, really super important part of hearing. So I would say, like if we relate it to vision, how the retina is one of the most important parts of being able to understand waves, light waves that are coming in. The cochlea is one of the most important parts to understand sound waves that are happening. So the cochlea, again, is this kind of coiled looking part here. It is a fluid-filled tube in our inner ear. So now talking about the cochlea and that like oval window, that is now talking about our inner ear part. So what happens is, like I said, all those hammer, anvil, and stirrup hit the oval window, which then triggers the fluid in the cochlea to start moving around, and that releases nerve impulses that'll then travel to your brain. On the top of the cochlea here, it's important to note that there's kind of three little loopy things up here. Those are our semicircular canals, and those are part of your vestibular sense, which helps you with your sense of balance. So I'm actually going to talk a little bit more about those in our next video, which has to do with some of our other senses. Um, so just know that this is where your semicircular canals are located in your ear, but they are actually more related to your sense of balance rather than your sense of hearing. So something that I have found personally that helps me a lot to understand these things is first kind of just looking at those images and reading like what are each of these different parts. But that's really hard then to picture like so what exactly are you talking about of how sound works here. So now what I've included here are a couple of different like animations or GIFs for each of these different parts of the ear so we can see exactly what it looks like because that then helps me visualize it and keep it in my brain a little bit better. So as I was saying, first we have the sound that comes in, and that is our waves, and that's coming through your outer ear into our auditory canal here. So that is, and then finally it ends for that last part of the outer ear that ends with your eardrum, otherwise known as the, what was it? That is the tympanic membrane. So that is our outer ear portion here. And you can see the rest of all those things we are just talking about with the middle and inner ear right here. So they're really tiny things, but let's look closer up at those now. So if we had on this outside part here, that's where the wave is coming in. It hits your eardrum. From there, we are now in our middle ear. The eardrum hits those three tiny little bones that we have. And the common names for them just come from the fact of what they kind of look like. So like we said, first we have the hammer, which is also known as the malleus. Then the malleus triggers the anvil, also known as the incus, that part there. And then finally, the incus then stimulates the stapes, which we call the stirrup here. And it kind of looks like a stirrup of like a saddle. If you're riding a horse, it's where you put your foot in. So that's why that one kind of looks like that. So it's this whole process of things being triggered here one after another. The wave comes in, hits the eardrum, that then triggers the malleus, which triggers the incus, which then triggers the stapes here. They all hit together and release this pressure that is then transformed and hits here into this oval window part. And that then travels to our next part of the ear. So let's keep going. Again, this is the middle ear part, those bones we just talked about. Hits our oval window, which then connects over here to our cochlea. So now this is our part of the inner ear. So the cochlea is that snail-looking coil thing that is filled with fluid, and the nerve impulse continues after that pressure from the hammer, anvil, and stirrup, and then goes into the cochlea where it fires there, and then is going to continue on into the rest of our brain, which we're going to get to next. And again, these kind of loopy things here are our semicircular canals, which have to do with balance more so than hearing. So I highly recommend always going through and looking at different animations and graphics to help you understand how these things work. Because it's one thing to just see the image there, but I think it helps a lot more to actually watch this animation like this of watching the process of how this stuff happens in your ear. So let's stop for our first question here. When you listen to music, the sound waves cause your what to vibrate first? So out of those things we just talked about, what is the first part that is triggered? That means we're talking about our outer ear here, and the only part that goes with our outer ear so far is the eardrum, also known as the tympanic membrane. So letter C is correct. All right, so again, just know the Latin and the English terms. So next we need to know, how does the sound wave move through the inner ear? So like we were talking about that part with the cochlea and everything. So in this image here, they have kind of uncoiled that cochlea because it's usually all tight coiled together, but they kind of uncoiled it a bit just so that for the sake of this image, we can see what it looks like a little bit better. So basically we have sense receptors, also called stereocilia, in our inner ear part here. That helps the wave then transmit from that sensation part. It goes through the process of transduction to then be converted into our perception part as it starts to get to the brain. So it's moving through this fluid part here. And the process of transduction happens through this thing called the basilar membrane. I've also heard it pronounced the basilar membrane, so you might hear it pronounced a couple of different ways. But basically, the basilar membrane is kind of where it's this like layer of tissue almost that we have, of then we have hair cells that are lining its surface there. So these little tiny hair cells are kind of getting pushed in this fluid as there's all the pressure coming in from the hammer, anvil, and stirrup, pushes the fluid that kind of triggers these hair cells in the basilar membrane, and that is what is helping it to go through the cochlea there. So just make sure that you know the basilar membrane, even though it's technically not one of your key terms that are in your book or anything. So the next part from there, finally, we're moving on from past the ear, how it then keeps traveling to your brain. So it then, those hair cells, also called cilia, those were triggered. And after those are triggered, they are then transferred into our auditory nerve. So remember when we in unit 2 we're talking all about neurons and how they fire and everything. That's kind of what's going on here, is the hair cells and the basilar membrane are trying to convert these waves now into these neurons that can fire into your auditory nerve. So I like to just keep making comparisons to the eye as I'm understanding the ear. So remember with the eye, the way that the eye then connects to the brain. Think real quick, what was that called? That was the optic nerve. That's how the eye connects and then sends signals to the brain. So in the ear, we have our auditory nerve. So there's the parts of the ear, the waves are all in there. The auditory nerve is then what connects the ear to the brain. So the auditory cortex then sends it through to your thalamus, and eventually then to your, the auditory nerve sends it to the thalamus and then to your auditory cortex. So you can see here, remember, what lobe is that in? Try to quiz yourself real quick. Your auditory cortex is stored in your temporal lobe, which is located kind of right here above your ears. And that's kind of easy to remember that hearing happens in the temporal lobe because they're right above your ears. That's how you can kind of remember where that's happening. So I highly recommend, again, then like looking at images like this. So we saw the whole middle ear. Well, first we've got our outer ear part here traveling through to the eardrum. Then that activates the hammer, anvil, stirrup to the oval window, the cochlea with the basilar membrane and all those hairs, then goes through the auditory nerve and eventually to your brain in the temporal lobe. All right, so I recommend looking back through this again and continuing to watch this and try to explain it to yourself a little bit. But I also did include here a short little 5-minute video that can really help you to understand this process of hearing as well, which has more animations. So 100% I recommend checking out this video and maybe a couple of others to help you understand this process of hearing. All right, next here. So yes, pay attention to how much time is devoted to each of these senses, because that kind of gives you a hint as to how much you'll likely see on the AP exam. Usually eyes are the thing that is most tested on the exam, but second to eyes is then your ears. So your eyes and ears are your most important senses in terms of the AP exam. And then your other senses, taste, touch, and smell, I will cover in the next video. Those are still important to know. You might see a question about those, but more likely to be your eyes or ears that you see. All right, so unfortunately then, sometimes we have hearing loss that can happen, and there are two main types of hearing loss. One is called sensorineural, and the other is called conduction hearing loss. So with sensorineural hearing loss, there is damage to the cochlea's hair cell receptors, or the auditory nerve. So there's some kind of damage in that inner ear part that's going on, either like the middle to inner ear part, or then how it's connected to your brain. That's with sensorineural. So that means you might have trouble, you might hear a sound, but you have trouble actually discerning what that sound is. Whereas with conduction hearing loss, that's some kind of problem to the mechanical system of the outer and the middle ear then, so like the eardrum. So it's saying that basically you're not able to get that conduction of the waves happening properly initially, and that's why you have that kind of conduction hearing loss. Of the two, sensorineural is the most common. That is what you would typically hear with hearing loss for people. Conduction is not quite as common, but I do want to show this image here to kind of help understand the difference a little more. So again, with sensory neural, there's a problem occurring either in the inner ear or the auditory nerve that then goes to your brain. So those will be things like just aging. Over time, as you get older, the hearing loss that you develop that's natural is sensory neural. It could also be noise damage. So if you're constantly being exposed to really loud noises, such as music, like when you put your headphones in, that's really, really going to hurt your ears. And that can then lead to things, it's linked with like dementia and other things we can talk about in class, but it's really, really dangerous. Sensory neural could also occur as a result of side effects of drugs. It could be auditory tremors or some kind of really loud blast or explosion when then maybe you hear like that ringing in your ears afterwards. That could be sensory neural hearing loss. Conduction hearing loss is that the sound never actually reaches the inner ear because of usually some kind of obstruction or trauma. So maybe it's that you have like fluid in your ears. So for example, like if you're swimming and you get water in your ears, that's getting stuck in that outer part of your ear. So then the sound waves can't really travel through the way that they need to into your middle and inner ear and eventually to your brain. There could also be some kind of object stuck in your ear, could be allergies, ruptured eardrum, or earwax also can lead to conduction hearing loss. So definitely know the difference between the two. Sensory neural is more common, and it's the more the sound waves are coming in, but you can't quite make sense of them entirely and get them sent to your brain correctly. Conduction is you can't really get those waves to come in properly the first time. So again, when you're talking about hearing loss and how much sound is too much, really, basically any noise that you can't talk over is probably harmful to you if it's prolonged and repeated. So like when we go to concerts, I love music and I love live music. But oh my gosh, our concerts loud. That is just blasting. And afterwards, when you leave, you know, your ears are ringing. That's just so uncomfortable. They're ringing because your hair cells are so overstimulated and they're triggered in a bad way inside of your ears. So you're really damaging your ears there. So this kind of just shows you here with decibels exactly what's damaging. So anything over 85 decibels can really be damaging to your ears. So the problem with headphones then is that all of your sound waves are directed into the auditory canal too much. So rather than the sound waves being dispersed throughout the air, it's all channeled directly into that auditory canal, and it's too much on that basilar membrane then. It's too harsh. But of course, larger headphones that go around your ears like that actually can help you then to block out some noise if things are kind of too loud. That kind of helps to stop other noises from coming in to then hurt those hair cells. So a couple little interesting facts here about hearing loss that you can look through on your own there. Um, a cochlear implant is something that helps to convert sounds into electrical signals to stimulate the auditory nerve through electrodes threaded into the cochlea. That's a lot of stuff right there. So let's take a look at it real quick. So if you've ever heard of a cochlear implant, it's kind of this thing that hooks like over your ear and behind it, as well as then this transmitter that's more connected into like your brain, that temporal lobe there. So any of this part here that's in like the gray and black, that's the cochlear implant. And basically what it's doing is trying to help turn those air waves into sound that can go through your auditory nerve and eventually transmit it to the brain. So that's something that can help with certain types of hearing loss. So second question here, because of repeated exposure to loud noise they're experiencing during their daily jobs, airport ground workers are most susceptible to damage um, which of the following? So which of the following will they most likely damage? Let's think about this one real quickly. This will be letter B, the cochlea. One little tip to help you out here is first of all, olfactory, we haven't talked about yet. That's the sense of smell, so that's unrelated. Ganglion and bipolar, that's in your eyes, so that's unrelated. Incus, malleus, and stapes, that's that middle ear part. But this example here is talking about your sensory neural hearing loss. So that means it's that inner ear, and that's where the cochlea is. All right, so how do we detect loudness? So this is what is really important now between these things called place theory and frequency theory. But basically, the brain interprets loudness from the number of activated hair cells in your ears. So first, let's talk about these two theories that we have here of how your brain detects pitch. The first is called place theory, and that means that basically different parts around that basilar membrane in your cochlea are getting stimulated, and that's how your brain determines pitches. So it depends on the specific area that is triggered there that generates the neural signal. That's how your brain then determines, depending on which part of the cochlea is being stimulated, that's how your brain determines what pitch it is. The other theory we have is called frequency theory, and that suggests kind of a different thing here. And it's basically that your brain determines the rate of neural impulses. So it's related to the frequency of how often neural impulses are traveling up the auditory nerve. So if your basilar membrane is vibrating with the sound wave, it triggers neural impulses to the brain at the same rate as a sound wave. So that means if the sound wave has a frequency of 100 waves per second, the pulses then are 100 pulses per second traveling to your auditory nerve. However, there's kind of this problem here with frequency theory. Your brain can only go up to this 100 pulses per second. The nerves can't go any quicker than that. So then that means, what do we do with the sounds that are actually traveling even faster than that? Frequency theory obviously can't fully explain that. So this kind of like addendum that was added on to the principle of the frequency theory is called the Volley principle. And that's saying that neurons will fire in rapid succession to then achieve a combined frequency of above 1,000 waves per second rather than just the 100 waves. So kind of like if you think in regards to like soldiers who alternate firing their weapons so that some can fire while others are reloading, that allows greater firepower overall. So the same thing here, one neuron will fire, and then while that one is going through its refractory period, the next one will fire. Then that goes through its refractory, then it'll fire again. So it's kind of just rotating which ones are going to lead to this overall greater combined power there. So basically, kind of where we're at today is that to determine sound, it's kind of a combination of these two theories, place and frequency theory. Place theory best explains how we hear high pitches. So place goes with those higher pitches. It depends on which part of your cochlea is stimulated. That then indicates those higher pitches. Whereas, and really it's that first part of your cochlea where it's connected to the oval window, that's your higher ones. And then we have frequency theory, which also through the Volley principle then explains how we sense those lower pitches, which are then on the closer to the inside of the basilar membrane, deeper in that cochlea there. So kind of we say that there's this combination of the two. Place theory helps with higher pitches, frequency theory helps with lower pitches. So a combination of the two helps with pitches in that intermediate range. So definitely make sure you know the difference between the two, which principle goes with higher, which goes with lower pitches. So this last question here, which of the following reflects the notion that pitch is related to the stimulation of different areas of the cochlear's basilar membrane? If we're talking about specific areas, that would be letter A, the place theory. That is telling us which part of the basilar membrane in the cochlea is stimulated. Last thing here, how do we determine where sounds are actually coming from? It all depends on the way that these waves are hitting your ears through the air. So basically, your brain can determine if a sound is coming at you straight on, it's straight in front of you, it will hit both ears equally. It will hit them at the same time and with an equal amount of loudness. If something is coming from the right side, your brain can determine that in your right ear, it's hearing the sound first and louder than your left ear. So your brain is able to calculate, okay, that must mean the sound came from the right. And same with on the left side, if the sound comes from the left, it first hits your left ear and it's louder there, whereas your head kind of blocks those sound waves from it being able to hit the right ear. So then your brain can determine, okay, that must be coming from the left. So your brain is pretty dang smart. It can determine where these things are coming from to determine where a sound is located. All right, so I apologize that's a bit long of a video, but hearing is absolutely a little bit complicated. Again, I encourage you to think of this as isn't it just fascinating how many things are going on all the time inside of your brain and your body that we are not even thinking about? So, all the things that your eyes are doing and your ears are doing to process sight and sounds and everything, it is truly incredible. So, definitely take some time to really think about that and be appreciative for the things that you do have with those senses. And I will see you again in our next video to talk a little bit about some of your other three senses there. Have a great day, everybody.